the lame. He even raises people from death. And we appreciate all these healing stories because we figure that one day we're going to be sick, and we hope that Jesus will heal us too. But in John's Gospel, there's usually a story behind the story, a deeper meaning, and there is in this scripture today. And the deeper meaning in the scripture today has to do with spiritual vision. The ability to see what's really important. In our gospel lesson, Jesus heals the blind man who begins to see all sorts of things. But not only does he see flowers and his neighbors and trees and loved ones, but he also sees something special about the one who has healed him. And as we move through the story, the blind man's understanding, his vision of Jesus, expands and grows. Now, I can't help but stop and think, when this man who was born blind and had never seen anything with his eyes, when he made his way in his blindness, as he probably had so many times, to the pool of Siloam, and suddenly his eyes were open, I wonder what he thought. Was he frightened? Was he just in glorious awe of everything? And I wonder, as he made his way back to familiar places, did he have to close his eyes to find his way because he'd never seen how to go before? Just a curious thought there. But this man did see spiritually the story behind the story, the deeper meaning. After he was healed and his neighbors asked what happened, at first all he could say was that Jesus had put mud on his eyes and told him to go wash, and then he could see. And later his vision grew so that when people asked to describe Jesus, who was he? He said, well, he's a prophet. And then it grew even more to the point that he believed in Jesus as the Messiah and worshipped him. Now that would still be a pretty simple story even at that, but there's another background story here because you see the healing took place on a Sabbath. And one of the 10 Commandments says, I think it's the third one, says remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. And it forbade work on the Sabbath. That was the Torah law, God's law. One of the 10 Commandments. So when the Pharisees learned that Jesus had healed a man on the Sabbath, they asked whether that was really necessary. Had Jesus done some unnecessary work on the Sabbath? So they asked, was this man going to die if Jesus had waited another day to heal him? No, he wasn't going to die, and he'd been blind all his life. Would one more day make a difference? And then they said, well, is there another reason why Jesus couldn't wait to heal this man on a non-Sabbath day? Maybe Jesus was not going to be here the next day. Well, that wouldn't be so because it was also a Sabbath rule that you couldn't travel on the Sabbath. So Jesus would still be here tomorrow. So why couldn't Jesus wait until sundown when the Sabbath would be over before healing this man? Well, the Pharisees concluded that Jesus had indeed performed unnecessary work on the Sabbath, dishonoring the Sabbath, but more importantly, dishonoring God. And the Pharisees were all about honoring God in the way they believed they should be honoring God. But still, there was the blind man. The man whose sight had been miraculously restored, and the Pharisees could not ignore him. So they discussed the matter among themselves. Some thought, well, Jesus must be a prophet of God, like the man said. And others thought, I don't know about Jesus being a prophet of God. You know, there's lots of imposters claiming to be prophets of God. He may just be another one of those. But the Pharisees applied this simple test. They said, no matter how good something might look, if it violates God's law, it's bad. Well, that's a pretty good test, actually. And if I had been a Pharisee in that time and place, I would have been pretty comfortable with that test. No matter how good something looks, if it violates God's law, it's not. But the Pharisees made a couple of mistakes in their test and in their thought processes. The first mistake about healing people on the Sabbath was not actually God's law. It was how the Pharisees had interpreted God's law. The law just said, keep the Sabbath day holy. That they should honor God by not working on the Sabbath. And over the centuries, Jewish scholars had debated about just what they meant, and they had applied their own ideas about what working on the Sabbath really meant, what amounted to work. And we just saw that one thing they thought is that if something was done that was necessary, it might not be work. But to do something that could be interpreted as work on the Sabbath when it could be done at some other time just as easily was considered work. But God never told them not to perform works of mercy and acts of compassion on the Sabbath. It was not God's law that Jesus had broken, but it was man's interpretation of God's law. Well, that was their first mistake, and that was a pretty big one. And their second mistake is that these Pharisees were educated, important people, and that had kind of gone to their heads. They liked their importance, and they assumed that they had all the answers. So they closed their minds to new ideas. They closed their eyes and they thought that they were seeing everything that there was to see. That was their second mistake, and that too was a big one. So when Jesus came onto the scene, they took a look at the wonderful things that he was doing, and they labeled him a lawbreaker and dismissed any possibility that he might be who he seemed to be. A prophet sent from God, a man whose word they needed to hear. They were blind when it came to Jesus' true identity. There's a secular story about being blind to future possibilities, and it has to do with computers. This happened before personal computers were in every household and changed our lives. A Xerox company developed a research center in Palo Alto, California, called PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. They called it PARC for short. And in 1977, 4 years before IBM came out with their personal computer, PARC conducted what they called a Futures Day, where they showed their inventions to the Xerox executives. And they had invented a personal computer. They called it the Alto. They also invented a mouse that you could use to draw images on the screen of the personal computer. And they had come up with other ideas such as networked printers and electronic file servers and the ability to send files around the world electronically. Xerox executives didn't go for it. They were copier people, you see, and they had a good business going with their copiers, and besides, who would buy one of those things? And why would you call that drawing thing a mouse? I mean, mice were pests. You just wanted to get rid of them. Some of the Xerox executives' wives were there, and they were on board with the computer. See, they had been secretaries in the past, and they saw the vision of what computers could do to change the office. But the executives still refused to listen, and so they left the computer and all these great ideas surrounding it on the table, if you will. They were blind to the possibilities. But a year or two later, a couple of kids named Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, were in San Jose, not far from Palo Alto, and they were working out of their garage when they picked those ideas up off the table and put them to work. And they called their computer the Apple. They didn't have much money, but they had their eyes open. They had a vision they could see, and the personal computer industry was born. Xerox had seen into the future and ignored it. They had left it on the table. They had owned the future, but turned their backs. It's often the very smart people that are the last to see, just as it was with the Pharisees, who were very educated and thought they knew it all and had seen it all, but they were the ones that were blind. The blind men could see Jesus, but not the Pharisees. The blind man could see that Jesus was a man of God, but the Pharisees thought he was a lawbreaker. The blind man could see that the Messiah had come, but the Pharisees could only say, well, we're disciples of Moses. When we become Christians, Christ redeems us. But we still struggle with sin. It's a lifelong struggle, but it is easier with Jesus. Through it all, Christ brings us into the light and gives us sight. He causes the scales to fall from our eyes. And sometimes our eyes clear up immediately. Sometimes over a period of time as we walk continuously with Jesus. It's usually a little bit of both. But Christ does bring us into the light. There's another example in our modern day. It's a past modern day, but it's our modern day, and it is a spiritual example. Martin Luther King Jr. received a vision, a dream. He was able to help other people see that vision, and still is helping people see that vision today after his own death. It was a vision of peace and brotherhood, a vision of the world as Christ would have the world to be. Amen. And it's not a coincidence that the people who marched with Martin Luther King Jr., black and white, were so often Christians, so often clergy, men and women committed to building a world that Christ had enabled them to see. King's vision came out of not only a bad experience with racism, but a good experience with Jesus Christ. What Jesus did for the blind man so many centuries ago, he can do for you. What Christ did for Martin Luther King so many decades ago, he can do for us today.